So I'm excited to introduce you guys to another female neurotheologian, brain faith type of person. So a little bit of background about Gena is that she's an associate professor of counselor education and the director of the Lois Henderson, is it Wessendorf?
Yep.
Wessendorf Center of Christian Ministry and Vocation at Seminary of the Southwest in Austin, Texas. So she's a licensed professional counselor, licensed marriage and family therapist, and a supervisor with an emphasis on systemic therapies, which consider the whole person and design interventions tailored to each person's uniqueness, because we are Imago Dei incarnate. We were pieces of God come to life. And I think that's fantastic. So what we want to talk about today is a special kind of conversation that I've had with God and that you've had with God, and separately, but I've never compared notes with anyone about this conversation. And so I want to share and hear what you have to say. And so I'm wondering if you can give us just a little bit of background and tell us how you came to the place where you started thinking about Jesus, being a human, and the very real consequence of what you and I study, but living life with a human brain and living in eternity with a human brain. So Jesus with a human brain. How did you start to come to think about that and like tiptoe into that space of wonder and revelation and intrigue?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'm just like I'm pausing on that phrase of like how we're each a unique reflection of Imago Dei and the incarnation. And so I'm going to go backwards in order to go forward to answer your question, which is to say that I have just had a deep interest in faith and theology because I had a profound experience with God when I was about 12 years old, and my uh, my parents divorced. My mom was a single parent school teacher of three young kids, and we just went through some hard years. And this sweet little neighborhood church is where I first just started reading the Bible and the stories of Jesus, and had just some encounters with God that I really couldn't explain late at night in my bedroom, praying by candlelight, reading the stories of Jesus. It was just so simple. And the love and the companionship that I felt helped me. I really had the felt sense that I wasn't alone, and
Mm.
it really changed my experience as a teenager of navigating those difficult situations. So since then, I was constantly trying to understand that theologically and read other authors who seemed to have had a similar experience with God, with the stories of Christ. And then I moved into some evangelical circles, some Southern Baptist circles. I was married to a Southern Baptist pastor for a couple decades, more than 2 decades. And I took a deep, deep dive into that understanding of what was happening on the cross and what salvation means, which, as I understood it, meant that uh, that forgiveness has to be purchased with a death, with violence. That's how I always understood the story of.
Mm.
And I've I think it's a way to explain my theological journey over these last 30 to 40 years has been trying to reconcile my experience of God in my bedroom when I was 12, and then the story of what was happening on the cross as I inherited that story, and thinking about um God requiring violence or a death was always something kind of in the corner of my eye when I would pray or when I would relate to that image of God, and I just couldn't reconcile it. I just couldn't. I didn't know how to.
Mm.
I couldn't fully, Jesse. I couldn't fully bodily relax in
Yeah,
that relationship.
right. Because you'd be primed for threat. I mean, because it's right there in the corner.
Yes. But I understood the way that that particular theological story hangs together with a lot of logical consistency, and I'm deeply committed to the scriptures, every part. And so it really wasn't until around 2018 that I met someone. I ended up sitting next to a theologian, James Allison, at a dinner party here in Austin at this sweet little urban farm that's kind of back in my neighborhood. And we were just eating a really simple meal from the garden, and there were twinkle lights. There were like crazy geese going wild in the background, and just this sweet gathering of friends. And James Allison had flown in from Spain, and I didn't know him, but I had read a little bit of his writing, and I did understand that he had a different understanding of what was happening on the cross.
Hmm.
And the core of that was incarnation. So going back to what you said about incarnation, and that notion that if Jesus was God in a body like ours, then number one, we can look to Jesus to learn everything about God that God wanted us to know. And
Yeah.
number two, that then there's something salvific was happening on the cross in that revelation of who God is and how non-violently Jesus responded to everybody in his life and then all the way through death. And so I just started I had started wondering what God was hoping we would understand. Like, what was God trying to communicate, and what would be the impact then on our bodily experience? And so, if salvation, because, like, as a neuroscientist, like when we were talking about things like healing or growth or maturing, we're talking about actual rewiring neural
Hmm.
pathways,
Yeah.
changes in
Physical
actual
change.
physical changes, anatomical change. And so I started to really wonder, what was God hoping that impact would be on our brains and bodies, on our nervous system? Like, for instance, if nonviolence is a hope that would flow from our encounter with the Christ story, that we would somehow be transformed into like an expanded capacity to love our enemies nonviolently and to respond to threat nonviolently. I was like, I can't do that. I know, I'm telling you right now,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
someone's threatening my child, I don't have the capacity to respond nonviolently. And so what piece of salvation am I not understanding then? Those were just questions I was trying to ask. And how did Jesus do that? Like, how did he, when in the Garden of Gethsemane, when he's being arrested, and there's this person who works with the high priest, and he is coming with the sword, and Jesus's friend Peter slices off the man's ear. And Jesus is like, "Oh, no, 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 that's not what we're doing here." And like he reaches out and heals the man's ear. Like he's like, here's your ear back. And I was like, what is happening in Jesus's brain and nervous system that allows him the presence of mind in that moment when he's under threat? He understands what that means. His friend is freaking out. There's blood. This man's ear has just been cut off. And Jesus is like so in his body, in his frontal lobe, with all cylinders firing. So that was the primary question. So anyway, I'm saying I arrived this night at this dinner party, and I sat down next to James Allison, who I didn't know, but I had read a little bit of his work, and I started talking with him. But what really intrigued me was I started to learn his story of,
Mm.
and I just started to understand he's been through so much pain, and his story is online and people can read about it. But what piqued my interest as a therapist and from a neurobiological standpoint is the forgiveness and love and peace and lightheartedness that was flowing from James when I was listening to him talk about his response back to the people that had injured him so deeply. I thought that defies neurobiological expectations. Like, I don't understand how your system is responding the way it is. And it
Right.
reminded me of Jesus. And I was like, I want to understand you better, your theology better. And that just started me on this whole path of going back and listening to the scriptures through the earpiece of brain science, asking these questions and really praying and trying to ask God, like, what is it really you were hoping we would understand through this story, and what
Mm,
impact are you hoping it would have on us? So I'm going to pause there because I imagine there's maybe some over overlapping interests or questions, just what I know about you, Jesse, and uh,
yeah.
where your faith journey has taken you. I'd love to just hear your, yeah, your reflections
Yeah.
on some of that.
No, I mean, I was just captivated, so I'm just, I'm just enthralled in listening. But I got into the thought pattern kind of the same way. I had a pretty traumatic, very traumatic childhood, and have been in therapy, for a good number of years. Let's, maybe 20, and just wanting to know what healing and wholeness looked like for me. Because I don't want to be triggered. I don't want to, PTSD was something I had to get healed from. And um but as we were working and I was finding the limitations of my humanity in, like, the things I couldn't choose and the things I couldn't do and the things that, like, why is it so hard to, when the bottom up biology is moving me into an anxiety attack, I have to, I have to come in the top down, and, like, that's so hard, right? And I don't want to be triggered, because that means something else has control over me without my permission. And, like, I'm too much of a control freak for that. But which is, part of the therapy stuff too. But I was like, I was starting to feel, so at one hand I'm getting healthier and I'm coming against the limitations and just seeing how much work that takes. And on the other hand, I was getting healthier, and so my coping mechanisms were being eroded. And I started to feel like that was making me more vulnerable as a leader, as a, in positions and responsibilities that I had. I'm like, wow, if I don't respond with power, then I'm not going to be as good of a leader. So I actually thought that the health was hurting my leadership long term, and that it was going to make me less capable of being a leader. Listen, the enemy was, like, all in there trying to, like, spin it. And I was yelling at God. I'm like, you're making me less adaptive, because I have less coping mechanisms, because I just didn't know who I was on the other side of those coping mechanisms. And I've learned that, and we've settled that, like, I'm actually just as strong, I'm just healthier. So it's better, but I had so many questions in the process, and I felt very limited, and I felt very vulnerable and exposed. And so that started a conversation of, like, looking to Jesus as the example of healthy without coping mechanisms, and yet also limited by the actual biology of threat response, by the actual biology of unlearning and learning, so I started being like, okay, so Jesus lives with a human brain. He lived successfully with a human brain. like like what's about that? So I can't just lean back, oh, well, I'm only human, in a way that gives excuse. But, like, how did he do that? And then for me, the follow-up thought was, he lives forever with a human brain. Like, forever in eternity, Jesus exists with a human brain. And what does that mean? What does that mean? Like, how does he think about time? How does he think about attachment? Like, how does he think with this 8 pounds of cortical tissue that we have extended in? How does that handle eternity? Like, I don't know. Anyway, there's no answers for that. I just get lost in the wonder of it. um but it made me feel more seen and more connected to, more permission for my humanity, but at the same time, um that there was a way to be healthy and successful in you taking apart the unhealthy coping mechanisms and leaning into full trust. And that's what I started to see Jesus, who fully relied on God. He didn't have coping mechanisms. He actually fully trusted. He lived moment by moment in this place of abiding, which now made more sense than when it was a top down kind of, like, exercise of will. So I don't think we will ourselves into much, because I don't actually believe in free will. I know too much about brain science,
Right.
but I do think that we can choose reactions once they start. We have a little bit of management there, but it was just interesting to me to see how much Jesus rested in the protection and the direction of the Father. And so I just wanted to, yeah, lean into that and ask those questions. So, I mean, but that's kind of how it's impacted my life. Like, how has it impacted the way that you see Jesus or how you see yourself?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Well, I'm resonating with so many pieces of your story that you just shared, including the piece where, like, right at the moment where we are maybe having something rewired in us, um, like you're talking about this getting healthy process that you then worried was going to diminish your power as a leader.
Mhm.
And, I can just relate in many ways where we're right at that threshold and it feels like, well, it feels like a death. It feels like something also valuable and important is gonna have to be sacrificed or is gonna have to die, and we're not, like, sure that it's gonna be resurrected in any, like, meaningful way,
No, I
or
mean, there's a
just
reason why we chose that, even if we can don't remember what it was. Like there was a benefit, right? And so now that benefit is going away, and we're like, I don't know,
yeah.
I don't know if I could do this.
Exactly, and so what I hear in that little bit of your story, and I'd love at some point to hear more though, is like that on the other side, what we discover is that, number 1, everything that dies is resurrected, and number 2, there's a true sacrifice is not required. Like if it had to be sacrificed, it wasn't of value to begin with. Like it's not the real thing, and so
Mm,
um whew, you just like, yeah, you said a you said a lot there, but I don't know, like, we just have to go through it and, like, experience it bodily and see on the other side, but then come back to tell people about it, so I'm glad you shared that little part of your story. How has it impacted me? Well, oh goodness, so certainly I was very aware of my limitations of my neurobiology and how relating to the image of God where my body was still kind of responding with a threat response was really not helping me ground and relax and access like all that full capacity of the frontal lobe and like empathy and creativity and choice in those moments that mattered. And so um, I was really curious. I just wanted to learn more from people whose theology did actually produce that in
mm,
that. Jesus, James Allison, a few other people. I just really wanted to understand like how are you relating to God and what are you experiencing in your body when you do? And I when I went back through then and listened to the scriptures also and stories of people throughout the Hebrew scriptures and then the New Testament, I also had that same recognition that you had. Like something's happening for them relationally that is regulating their nervous system to the degree that even when they're facing a threat, they can retain access to their frontal lobe and make a choice to respond nonviolently, to respond creatively, to respond with compassion. Um, so I
mm,
read all through the scriptures from Genesis all the way through the epistles, and that ended up being the conclusion. That was the theme that emerged was trust. Trust defined as a neurobiological phenomenon where certain neurotransmitters are released in the brain that have a
right.
warm, soothing, pleasant, calming effect on the body. But trust is related to perception. And so this is also what really emerged in this. So this is The Brain and the Spirit, the book that I ended up writing through and it just goes chronologically from Genesis all the way through the stories. And because trust is like a thermostat for the body, and it's and the body tells the truth. The body doesn't lie. It's telling us the truth about how we're perceiving someone or something as either trustworthy or untrustworthy. And that may or may not be rooted in reality, but it's telling us something true about our perception.
Right.
And so when we're perceiving God, our body is an indicator as to whether or not we're perceiving God as trustworthy or untrustworthy. And I was constantly trying to do mental gymnastics to tell my body, no, this image of God is trustworthy. And my body was saying, I am not perceiving God that way. I'm not perceiving God as trustworthy. And so when I read the stories of Jesus with this idea of incarnation, that when we look to Jesus, we're perceiving God accurately. So let
Mhm.
that update our image of God. All through the story of Christ, Jesus never was violent, never punished anyone. He forgave freely. When the paralytic was lowered down on the mat through the roof, and Jesus looked at him and said, your sins are forgiven today. And everyone else in the room was like, "What's he saying? That's blasphemy. Who could forgive sins?" And Jesus was like, "I can. I just did." And nobody else's legs had to be broken for that. Nobody else
Mm,
had to suffer in his place. It's almost like Jesus is saying, "You have always already been forgiven.
yeah, yeah,
Perceive it. Perceive it and allow that to change your sense of yourself, your neurobiology, maybe your physical anatomy, who knows? But it's perception. It's the change in perception that releases the trust response when we are actually in the presence of someone trustworthy. And so I will tell you, I will now be working that out theologically and in an embodied way for the rest of my life, but it's already having an impact on my relationships, like the freedom that I feel to respond to threat
yeah,
in my
yeah,
relationships. And so, um,
yeah.
very
I mean, that's
curious.
like why
But
Dallas Willard says that the measure of Christianity or the measure of your Christ likeness is how quickly you can move into enemy love. Not there's no theology test, right? Because we'd all have different answers. And so, but there's that there's no other test but that. And that demonstrates an attachment to God that's secure. And what's interesting to me though about trust is that, as a psychologist, there's the paradigm, and I agree with it. I hold it right now, is that trust is something that only comes on the other side of conflict. That before conflict we just have agreement, but after we have conflict and we repair with one another, and then we believe that that relationship is strong enough to handle conflict, then we have trust. So trust isn't, it's about connection that has been tested in order to have trust. And it just makes me wonder, I can point to all those things in my life, but where did Jesus get tested? Like how did he have that? Like I've spent a lot of time struggling with faith, working with God, asking him hard questions, only a couple of which he answers, but like it's been such an overt, explicit journey. And I look at the life of Jesus and I'm like, where did he work that out? Like, I don't know.
I,
I don't know. What
I,
do you think?
well, I feel such a, like you said, such a like a kindred kinship with you because I think we just ask similar questions and like we've been on very different journeys, but just come to some really similar conversations. So when I think about Jesus's time in the wilderness and where he was wrestling with the image of Satan, which also represents just all the messages, like all the messages growing up, I think wrapped up in that image is everyone Jesus knew and was who were trying to shape or tell him how to be human. And so um he's wrestling with trust out there in the desert and he's hungry. So
Mhm.
one of the questions
Yeah.
is like, do I have enough food, like to survive? Can I wait patiently and not force a situation but wait until it's the right time to eat? um y- uh can I have the influence, the positive, loving, good, nonviolent influence I want to have on the world? Can I have it as just who I am? Is that enough? Or do I need this like higher authority, power, glory? So I should, become a ruler of cities and kingdoms, or I don't really know what when he was tempted to throw himself off of the cliff, if that was possibly a moment of depression and suicidality where he's like, this whole thing is too much. Like, I don't know that I want to sign up for this. Or if it really was about like trying to do something miraculous that people would say, I don't know. But all of that I
The
see as
depression or shortcut.
a shortcut, something. Yes. So, but each time it's his relational connection, like you're calling attachment with God, that I see as coming in and regulating, and him being like, no, I'm okay. Like, I have what I need. I'm hungry now, but I know I'll eat at some point. I'm scared now, but I know I'll be okay. And I can have the influence, the loving, positive influence on the world that I want to have just as me. Like, I'm enough. And um, what a powerful, like you're
Yeah.
saying, it's about connection, disconnection, and reconnection. So he's disconnecting from God, and not stressful. And I think that's important, a piece of this conversation, Jesse, because stress is necessary. A little bit of stress is necessary. We don't anatomically, like, we don't rewire pathways without a little bit of stress.
Right. Because there's not a reason to spend the energy to do it if it ain't that broke,
Right.
we don't fix it. It has to be really broke.
So if there's too little stress in our lives or in our bodies or our relationships, will stagnate.
Hmm.
If there's too much stress, we'll shut down, we'll overwhelm. So we need just the right amount. And you mentioned time earlier, like, how did Jesus and his human brain navigate time, and what does that mean after death and eternity, perhaps? Like, when we're living in timelessness. And I'm very fascinated by that question. Who knows? But I do wonder if time is the thing. Like, if our struggles as living in human bodies all goes back to time, because time is the thing that is the number one discrepancy between us and God, or created creation and non-created existence. Time is the one variable that is incongruent between the two.
Hmm.
And time equals stress. Like, time is change in space, movement, which requires energy, which requires stress. But in the just right Goldilocks zone of stress, we feel at our best, like our absolute best. We are growing and flourishing and learning and making new connections with just the right amount of stress. And I do wonder if that's perhaps how God set it up from the beginning, is
Yeah.
relationally to regulate our stress to that just right zone. And we just feel it. So we're so sensitive to when we move out of that just right zone. Um, and all the problems that we want to solve are caused by when we move one way or the other out of that just right stress
Mm.
zone. So, yeah. And trust is really what keeps us in that just right zone.
Right. Because it releases enough of the oxytocin hormone, as people as the nerds out there will enjoy. But the I trust you hormone is
Yeah.
how
Yes.
everyone else calls it, neurotransmitter. Um, so what do you think that how has this changed the way that you think about disciple making and discipleship? Like, if that connection with God is to help us regulate so that we can be fully human, we can be fully ourselves, and
Yeah.
that's all positive, um then what do you how do you apply this or think about this then when you're helping people think about being a disciple maker or coming alongside someone else in their journey? I mean, we each have our own journey, and I think sometimes I can be very consumed with my own journey of growth and connection to God and everything, and I think of that as a very AB kind of tether and dynamic, very private. But you and I both know that the human brain is actually it's a social thing. Like, the humans are social creatures. We were created like herd creatures. And so there's not a part of our humanity that exists apart from connection to other people. So I always try to think about this stuff in discipleship in terms of disciple making. How am I
Mhm.
walking with somebody else in this space too? What am I encouraging someone else? What am I pointing out, or what am I, what bad stuff or bad lies am I talking them out of? Like, it's okay to go to therapy. Being healthy doesn't make you less qualified. Like, the Holy Spirit told me that, but now I can tell it to somebody else out loud because I just pass that message along. But yeah. How about for you?
Yeah, I'm smiling because one of the things I've really enjoyed from the times we've talked, Jesse, is just like how practical your questions are, like how you're really interested in the lived experience. Like, how does this work itself out relationally in our bodies? And um, I didn't grow up with that idea of discipleship. That's not what I was taught. That's not how I was discipled for, several decades. And in my evangelical tradition, there were these four spiritual laws tracks that were printed and dropped off at bus stops around college campuses,
Or
and
left it as tips
or left as
at
tips
tables?
to really sad wait staff.
Yeah.
And so there's a graphic in the four spiritual laws tracks that talks about like facts, faith, and feelings, or faith, facts, and feeling. Anyway, feelings is always the caboose, and it's like don't let your feelings drive the train; it'll go off the track. And I think that it's possible that that teaching has had more of a damaging impact on the ways that churches think about discipleship than anything else I can think of
Mm,
in recent decades. The impact for a lot of us was to mistrust the signals that our bodies are telling us, that our emotions are telling us, and sort of default to the assumption that whatever I'm feeling, wanting, or desiring is the truth is probably the opposite of it.
yeah.
And as like a really helpful alternative, I think about Ignatian spirituality. So one of the
Mm,
contributions of Saint Ignatius is this idea that under the right circumstances, like he calls it consolation, like when we're sort of inclined toward just doing those practices, I think committing to daily practices that kind of like nourish us, like you're talking about, just like we're being as healthy as we can. Our emotions and our body become more reliable sources of information about what's right for us, what God may be communicating to us. And so learning to learning to read those signals, learning to discern. I think that's what the word discernment really means.
mhm.
Um, and valuing the information that our emotions and our body is contributing to the bigger picture. It's not the full picture, but it's a really important source of information that we have to learn and train and disciple ourselves to pay attention to. And
Mhm.
yeah, that's where I see your work being really, really important and really impactful. You're contributing something important, I think, to that conversation about discipleship.
Oh, well. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. I mean, just I've just experienced freedom, right? So just I believe that free people free people. So can pass that along. But I love your book, The Brain and the Spirit, and it just came out recently, but you tell some of these stories in there, and I love that you shared some of these stories, but you also I think you just unpack things in a real beautiful way. And I love how you have art, images, you have poetry. When I did the first draft of my book, I also had all that kind of stuff because I'm like, we got to be creative, guys. We can't just be didactic. But it didn't make it through the editing process. So kudos on you for somehow getting that through the editing process. I'm kind of jelly right there. I'm just like, oh,
Your next book
you're
will
living
work.
my life. You're living my best life.
Your next book will make sure it has
Oh
more of
my
those
gosh.
elements.
So I definitely think that people should pick it up and sit with it. You know, Balthazar has been a really great person for me to read, to sit with about the contemplative space and people who've had these deep experiences with God. And so he's like yeah, Hans von Balthasar. But when I read your book, I kind of see some of those experiences, not described from the point of view of a theologian like Balthasar did, but from the like, if there was somebody else in the room walking and talking with Balthasar, and they were having conversations, what would what would you pick up? And so I don't know, I really appreciated your book in that way as well, and highly, highly recommend it to people out there. If people want to know more about you or where to read more of the stuff that you're writing or working on, where can they find you?
Yeah, so there's a growing online community on Instagram at The Brain and the Spirit. And then the website, thebrainandthespirit.com, has a number of just reflections on how these conversations connect with other pressing problems that we care about, racism and the
Mm.
climate collapse, um, and then some liturgical resources for groups and church communities who want to have these conversations and use this in their discipleship.
I love that. I love it. Oh my gosh. Well, it's been so, so fantastic to talk with you and have this conversation and just explore the wonder of, I don't know, being a word incarnate, a piece of the Imago Dei incarnate, and what does that call us into, and what what does that crazy journey look like? So I've just really, really enjoyed having you on, and um, yeah, it's been such a pleasure. Been such a pleasure.
It's been such a joy to connect with you, Jesse. Yeah, I'm really excited about the conversations you're hosting.
Yeah. I'm so glad you could be part of them. It makes me so happy.